Good evening. I am the registrar of the Axiom School, and tonight we convene the first session of our public tribunal. A formal debate on the most consequential question of our generation. In January of 2024, Pluto, the slowest, the deepest, the most unrelenting of the transpersonal planets, crossed the threshold into the sign of Aquarius. It will remain there for 2 decades, with a brief return to Capricorn, and will not fully clear the sign until March of 2044. Nothing in astrology moves more slowly, and nothing moves more deeply. The entire 20th century's Pluto cycles are behind us. We stand at the hinge. Tonight, 2 master delineators will argue opposing theses. Arguing for revolution, that this ingress liberates the collective, dismantles hierarchy, and opens the commons, is Aurora Voss, whose work on planetary sociology has redefined how we read the outer planets as structural conditions rather than personal events. Arguing for collapse, that this ingress hardens surveillance, deepens oligarchy, and fractures the social contract, is Marcus Thorne, whose theory of the Panopticon protocols has been called the most disturbing astrological model of the decade. The format: opening statements, 2 rebuttal rounds, a midpoint analysis duel, 3 questions from the assembled school, closing arguments, and my synthesis. Each speaker is bound by 3 rules. 1. Every claim must carry a chart or a cycle. 2. No appeals to authority without dates. 3. The debate is won by whoever explains the evidence with the least distortion. Let us begin.
Thank you, Registrar. I want to begin with a correction of the record, because the way we name this ingress already contains the verdict. We call it Pluto in Aquarius, and we imagine a static placement, a noun, a position. But Pluto is not a position. Pluto is a process. It is the slowest harmonic in the astrological system, 248 years to circle the zodiac, which means it does not describe personalities. It describes architecture. It describes the load-bearing structure of a civilization. And when Pluto enters a sign, it does not affect people. It rebuilds the conditions under which people live. So what does it mean, structurally, that Pluto now occupies the sign of the water-bearer? Aquarius is the constellation of the collective network, the sign of friendship, of the assembly, of the distribution of power across many nodes rather than its concentration in one throne. And I will argue tonight that the Pluto ingress into Aquarius is the single most important redistribution event in 248 years. The last time Pluto was in Aquarius, from 1778 to 1798, the Atlantic revolutions tore the old hierarchies apart: America, France, Haiti. The last time Pluto was in the sign of the water-bearer, the commons rose, and the divine right of kings was retired from history. It was not a smooth revolution. It was violent, contradictory, often horrifying. But it redistributed. And I say to you, we are in the second act of that play. The institutions of the 20th century, the corporation, the nation-state's monopoly on information, the broadcast model of culture, the centralized archive, are the Capricorn structures that Pluto spent 2 decades dismantling from 2008 to 2024. Now the architect arrives to build the replacement. And the replacement is not a building. It is a network. This is the Commons thesis. Pluto in Aquarius re-commons power. It takes what was hoarded, knowledge, energy, attention, authority, and returns it to the many. We already see the opening moves. Decentralized ledgers, open-source intelligence, the collapse of the gatekeeper class, the emergence of the creator as institution, the public's refusal to accept the single authorized narrative. That is Aquarius. That is the water-bearer pouring the archive out onto the street. And if you tell me this is collapse, I will show you that what you call collapse is merely the sound of the old load-bearing wall coming down, and what is being built behind it is the commons.
Thank you, Registrar, and thank you, Aurora, for that beautiful and seductive fairy tale. Because that is exactly what it is, seductive. And that is precisely the danger. I will argue tonight that the Pluto in Aquarius ingress does not liberate the collective. It weaponizes the collective. Aquarius is not the sign of the commons. It is the sign of the network, and the network has a master. Let me be precise, because I know the charts. Aquarius is ruled by Saturn and co-ruled by Uranus. And what is the astrological signature of the network? Aquarius governs electricity, computation, frequency, the crowd, the signal, the machine. Now overlay Pluto, the planet of power, of coercion, of the elimination of everything that is not essential. Pluto in Aquarius is the power planet transiting the sign of the machine. And I ask you, what do machines do to crowds? They sort them, they rank them, they score them. Pluto in Aquarius is not the revolution of the people, it is the optimization of the people. Consider the last Pluto in Aquarius, which Aurora cited. Yes, the Atlantic revolutions. But also consider what else that window contained: the rise of the modern surveillance state, the police state, the prison as an industrial institution, the invention of the passport, the census as a tool of control, the first modern totalitarianisms. Pluto in Aquarius does not abolish the panopticon. It digitizes the panopticon. I have named this the panopticon protocols. When Pluto transits Aquarius, power does not retreat, it relocates. It abandons the visible throne, the crown, the obvious center, and it installs itself in the protocol, in the algorithm, in the score, in the terms of service, in the unread fine print, in the surveillance architecture that no one voted for and no one can see. And what is the evidence of our own moment? Generative intelligence that watches every keystroke and every pattern of attention. Biometric identity welded to financial access. Social credit systems rising on every continent. The corporation achieving legal personhood while the human is reduced to a data point. That is not the commons. That is the panopticon with better optics. And I will tell you the deepest truth of this ingress. Pluto is not a liberator. Pluto is the lord of the underworld. When the lord of the underworld enters the sign of the network, he does not come to free the network. He comes to own it.
Two theses are now on the table, and both are internally coherent, which is exactly why this debate matters. Aurora Voss has argued that the ingress redistributes power toward the commons, and cites the historical precedent of the Atlantic revolutions. Marcus Thorne has argued that the ingress concentrates power inside invisible protocols, and cites the panopticon, the surveillance architecture, as the truer Aquarian expression. Notice that both speakers agree on one thing: the institutions of the 20th century are dying. They disagree on what is being born. Before we proceed to rebuttals, I will ask each speaker to sharpen their claim into a single falsifiable statement. A prediction that can, in principle, be tested by the evidence of the next 5 years. Aurora, if you please.
The registrar asks for a falsifiable claim, and I will give him one. Here is my prediction. By 2030, the share of creative and intellectual production held by non-institutional actors, independent creators, open communities, decentralized research networks, will have doubled relative to 2024. That is testable. That is the commons thesis made measurable. And now let me rebut Marcus directly, because his argument is elegant and I want to honor it before I take it apart. Marcus says the network has a master. I say, show me the master. The terrifying truth about Aquarius is that the network is leaderless by design. No one owns the internet. No one owns the commons. The protocols are open, and every attempt to lock the network down, every firewall, every walled garden, every platform that tries to own the crowd, is precisely what Pluto in Aquarius destroys. Do you remember what happened to the broadcast empires? Pluto was in Capricorn from 2008 to 2024, and it dismantled the gatekeepers of the 20th century, the record labels, the studios, the newspapers, the broadcast networks. They did not survive the Capricorn Pluto. Their power evaporated, and Marcus calls that collapse. I call it the commons. Now he will tell you the panopticon is rising, and he is not wrong that surveillance exists. But he is wrong about who holds the panopticon. In the 20th century, the panopticon had one owner, the state. In the 21st, the panopticon is being broken open, leak after leak, Archive after archive, the watchers watched. Pluto in Aquarius does not build the panopticon. It haunts the panopticon. It is the planet of exposure, of excavation, of the buried truth dragged into light. The first half of this decade has already proven it. The secrets did not stay buried. And that is because the Lord of the Underworld is not the warden. He is the one who opens the graves.
Aurora wants a testable claim, so I will give her two. First, by 2030, the number of human decisions that are made by opaque algorithmic systems, credit, employment, healthcare access, housing, will have increased, not decreased, and no democratic mechanism will have been created to audit them. Second, the concentration of wealth in the top 1% will be higher in 2030 than it is today. Those are testable, and they are the panopticon protocols made measurable. Now, Aurora, you say the network has no master, and I want to take that claim seriously, because it is the hinge of your entire thesis. You are right that no one owns the internet. But that is exactly the problem, and this is the point you refuse to see. No one owns the network, and everyone owns the network, which means the network is owned by whoever controls the protocol. And the protocols are not democratic. They are written by the few and accepted by the many, invisible, unread, unchallenged. That is the purest Aquarian architecture of control. The law that no one reads, the terms that no one understands, the score that no one can appeal. And you say Pluto exposes secrets. Yes, Pluto exposes secrets, and then plutocracy absorbs the exposure. Every leak becomes a dataset. Every transparency becomes a compliance regime. Every exposure becomes a new database of the exposed. That is the dark alchemy of this ingress. The Lord of the Underworld does not free the buried. He monetizes the buried, and I will give you the deepest evidence of all, the one chart we have all seen. Pluto in Aquarius squares Uranus in Taurus from 2026 through 2028. A square between the planet of power and the planet of rupture, on the axis of the machine and the axis of wealth. Aurora, you read that square as creative destruction. I read it as class war fought with algorithms. The commons thesis requires that the many win. But the many are not an actor. The many are a resource. And this ingress is the greatest resource extraction event in the history of the species, the extraction of human attention, human identity, and human trust itself.
We now arrive at the technical heart of the evening, the midpoint analysis duel. Both speakers have agreed to apply the mathematics of midpoints to the debate itself. For those who are new to the school, a midpoint is the point of equal distance between two planets, the hidden third that exists between any pair. In the tradition of Eberton and the Hamburg School, midpoints are the most sensitive points in the chart, the places where the energies of two planets meet and compound. The radical midpoint structure of a collective, a nation, a movement, a civilization, is the web of midpoints in its founding chart, and it is activated when transiting planets cross it. Both speakers have been given the same event to analyze, a single date that stands as the pivot of our decade, January 20th, 2025, the day of the American presidential inauguration, when Pluto sat at 1 degree Aquarius in direct opposition to the United States natal sun. Aurora, you have the first move in the duel. Show us the midpoints.
Thank you. I take as my working chart the United States of America, born July 4, 1776, with a radical sun at 13 Cancer, a radical moon at 21 Aquarius, and a radical Mercury at 12 Cancer. Now watch what happened on January 20th, 2025. The transiting sun stood at 0 Aquarius 58, and here is the midpoint that matters. Transiting Pluto at 1 degree Aquarius formed the midpoint of transiting Mars and transiting Jupiter, the war point and the expansion point, within 1 degree, at 0 Aquarius. That is the signature of mobilization. Pluto, the power planet, at the midpoint of Mars and Jupiter, the aggression and the ambition, in the sign of the collective itself. Now the deeper structure. the radical Sun of the United States at 13 Cancer holds the midpoint of the radical Pluto and the radical Saturn, the national power axis, at 12.5 Cancer. And on January 20th, transiting Venus at 11 Capricorn was in exact opposition to that Sun, and transiting Mercury at 19 Capricorn was applying to the square of the radical ascendant. What does this mean? It means the inauguration chart is a mobilization chart, not a collapse chart. Pluto at the Mars-Jupiter midpoint in Aquarius is the people's engine being ignited. The American radical moon in Aquarius, the national soul in the sign of the water bearer, is being visited by the transpersonal planet of transformation, and the midpoint structure says, the collective itself is becoming the actor. Not the president, not the party, the collective. That is the commons thesis written in the dial. When Pluto activates the radical moon of a nation, the nation does not fall. The nation is refounded. It is terrible, it is violent, it is uncertain, but the midpoints do not lie about direction. They lie about comfort.
Aurora has shown you a mobilization chart. Now I will show you the same chart from the other side of the dial, and this is the discipline that separates delineation from wishful thinking. Take the same inauguration chart, January 20th, 2025. But let us look at the midpoints that Aurora did not mention. The transiting moon stood at 17 degrees Scorpio, in the 8th house of the national chart, the house of debt, death, and other people's money, and it was applying to the exact midpoint of transiting Saturn and transiting Neptune. The midpoint of contraction and dissolution, at 18 Scorpio. That is not mobilization, that is the signature of systemic loss of faith. Now the radical chart again. The United States has a radical Pluto at 27 Capricorn and a radical Mars at 17 Virgo. Their midpoint falls at 7 degrees Scorpio, the national fracture point. On January 20th, transiting Jupiter at 11 Gemini squared that midpoint by 4 degrees, and transiting Uranus at 21 Taurus squared it by 7. Jupiter-Uranus, the expansion of the rupture, bearing down on the national fracture midpoint. But here is the midpoint that ends the debate, and I want you to write this down. The radical Sun of the United States at 13 Cancer and the radical Saturn of the United States at 16 Libra. Their midpoint falls at 14.5 degrees Scorpio. That is the national contract, the agreement between the sovereign and the structure. And on January 20th, transiting Mars stood at 24 Scorpio, 9 degrees beyond that midpoint, separating. Meaning, the contract had already been struck and already been broken before the day began. Aurora, you see an engine igniting. I see a covenant already defaulted. The midpoints do not care which of us is optimistic. They record the stress, and the stress signature of this decade is not the people rising. It is the people being sorted, the fracture midpoints activated by the rupture planets, over and over, until the contract between the sovereign and the structure is rewritten by the only power that survives every revolution, the power that controls the protocol.
The duel has given us both readings of the same mathematics, and this is the honest difficulty of our discipline. The dial does not argue, but the delineators do. We now open the floor to the assembled school. 3 questions. The first comes from the audience. Both of you claim the midpoints support your side. How do we, as students, decide which delineation is true and which is projection? What is the falsification protocol for a midpoint reading?
The question is the most important one asked tonight, so I will answer it with full precision. A midpoint reading is falsifiable in exactly 3 ways. First, timing. A midpoint activation has a window. If I claim an event at a midpoint, I must specify the orb and the date of exact activation, and then the record must show the event at that date, not a year later. Second, structure. The midpoint must be part of a repeating pattern. The same midpoint activated by multiple transits across a cycle, not a single flash that proves nothing. Third, outcome. The event must match the quality of the planets forming the midpoint. A Mars-Saturn midpoint produces fracture and delay, not celebration. If my reading passes all three, it is a reading. If it fails anyone, it is projection, and it belongs in the wastebasket. And I will be honest with you, most astrology, including most professional astrology, fails the second and third tests. That is why the discipline has been exiled from the academy. Not because the mathematics is weak. Because the practitioners are lazy. The fix is not to abandon the dial. The fix is to become worthy of it.
Aurora has given you a beautiful protocol, and I agree with all three tests, which is why I insist on a fourth, and it is the one she will not state. The fourth test is, whose chart? Midpoint analysis is only as honest as the chart you assign to the collective. The United States has at least 3 credible natal charts: the 4th of July, the ratification of the Constitution, the first meeting of Congress. Each produces a different radical midpoint structure. Each can be made to support any narrative. And this is the deepest methodological scandal of collective astrology. We choose the chart that proves our thesis, and we call it scholarship. So my answer to the student is this: before you trust any midpoint reading of a nation, demand the chart selection protocol. Why this chart and not the others? What does the alternative chart show? If the answer is a shrug, the reading is decoration. The panopticon of astrology is not the dial. It is the selection of the chart. And until we audit our own selections, we are not astrologers. We are advocates.
The second question from the floor. The Pluto in Aquarius ingress will not complete until 2044. How should a practicing astrologer, someone who reads charts for real clients, translate this collective architecture into an individual consultation? What do we tell a client who asks, "What does Pluto in Aquarius mean for me?"
Tell them the truth. It is not about them. That is the first act of professional honesty, and it is also the first act of the commons thesis. The outer planets do not describe the individual. They describe the era, and the era is the load-bearing structure of every individual life. So the correct answer to the client is, Pluto in Aquarius is not your personal event. It is the rebuilding of the conditions in which your life will be lived. Your networks are being repriced. Your relationship to the collective is being renegotiated. Your membership in institutions is being renegotiated. Your value in the new economy is being renegotiated. And then, only then, do you look at the house in their chart that Aquarius occupies, and the aspects that transiting Pluto makes to their personal planets, and you translate the era into the life. The client who understands this leaves the consultation with a map, not a fortune. The client who demands a fortune leaves disappointed, and that disappointment is the beginning of their education. We are not in the prediction business. We are in the orientation business. Pluto in Aquarius orients us toward the commons. Our job is to help each client find their place in the pouring of the water.
Aurora's answer is humane, and I respect it, but I will give the client a very different map, because the map must be honest about the terrain. Pluto in Aquarius, in the individual chart, is the planet of power transiting the sign of the network. Which means, for the client, the next 20 years will be about the renegotiation of visibility. What is known about them? What is scored about them? What is extracted from them? The client who ignores this ingress is the client who wakes up in 2035 with a digital identity they never consented to, a reputation they never managed, and a credit they never earned. So here is the practical protocol I give my clients, and I will give it to you tonight. First, audit your digital footprint as if it were a financial statement, because it is. Second, diversify your value. Never let your livelihood depend on one platform, one algorithm, one score, because Pluto in Aquarius will reprice every single node in the network, and you do not want to be a single node. Third, own your data, your archive, your records, because the panopticon is built from records, and the people who own their records are the people who cannot be sorted. And fourth, the deepest one, build genuine community, not audience. Audience is a resource, community is a commons, and in the Pluto in Aquarius era, the resource gets extracted, but the commons endures. That is my advice to the client, and it is my advice to you. Do not ask what the revolution will give you. Ask what you are building that the collapse cannot take.
The final question from the floor. Each of you has introduced an original framework tonight, the Commons Thesis and the Panopticon Protocols. How do we know these frameworks are astrology and not simply political philosophy wearing a zodiac costume? What makes a theory astrological rather than ideological?
A theory is astrological when it is bound to the mathematics of the cycles, when its predictions change as the cycles change. The Commons Thesis is astrological because it is derived from a specific, dated, measurable ingress. Pluto entering Aquarius in January of 2024, retrograding back into Capricorn, and re-entering Aquarius in November of the same year. Every claim I make tonight is indexed to that astronomical fact, and to the 248-year cycle that produced it. Political philosophy says, power should belong to the many, because it is just. Astrology says, power will move toward the many, because the cycle demands it, and it says this independent of whether we find it just. That is the difference between ideology and delineation. Ideology tells you what ought to happen. Delineation tells you what is happening, and when, and why the cycle requires it. And the most humbling discipline of our practice is this: the cycles do not care about our politics. Pluto was in Aquarius during the French Revolution, and it will be in Aquarius during whatever our descendants build, and if we read the chart correctly, we will see the same shape in both. The dismantling of the centralized archive, the return of knowledge to the many, the refusal of the crowd to be governed by the few. If that sounds like politics, it is because politics is one of the places where astrology becomes visible. The stars are not partisan, but they are structural.
I will answer with a single chart, because the question deserves evidence, not assertion. The Panopticon Protocols are astrological because they are bound to a specific astronomical sequence, and here it is. Pluto in Aquarius from 2024, Uranus entering Gemini in 2025 and 2026. Neptune entering Aries in 2026. Saturn entering Aries in 2025 and 2026. 4 outer planets changing signs within 36 months, the densest outer planet realignment since the 1960s. No political philosophy generated that fact. The ephemeris generated that fact. And the Panopticon Protocols are the reading of that fact. Pluto in the sign of the network, Uranus in the sign of information, Neptune in the sign of the warrior, Saturn in the sign of the pioneer. The structure of the next 15 years is written in that alignment: the war of narratives, the weaponization of information, the surveillance of the signal, the struggle over who owns the story. That is not ideology. That is the ephemeris, read honestly. And here is the test that separates my framework from a costume. The protocols make dated predictions that the Commons Thesis cannot absorb. By 2027, I predict the surveillance of digital identity will be legally normalized in the majority of G20 states. By 2029, I predict a major crisis of algorithmic decision-making, a scandal, a collapse, a reckoning, that forces the first global audit of automated power. Those are dated, falsifiable, and derived from the sign changes. If I am wrong, the dial will say so. And that, students, is the only honest definition of astrological theory, a claim that the ephemeris can kill.
The debate is concluded, and the school owes both speakers its gratitude, because they have done what the discipline rarely does. They have made the stakes visible. Aurora Voss has shown us the Commons Thesis, the reading of Pluto in Aquarius as the redistribution of power toward the many, bound to the Atlantic precedent, tested by the measure of independent production, and anchored in the midpoint of the collective moon. Marcus Thorne has shown us the panopticon protocols, the reading of the same ingress as the digitization of control, bound to the surveillance precedent, tested by the measure of opaque algorithms and concentrated wealth, and anchored in the fracture midpoints of the national contract. And the honest conclusion, the postmodern conclusion, is that both are true, and neither is complete. That is the nature of the outer planets. They do not give us one future. They give us a field. The field of Pluto in Aquarius contains both the commons and the panopticon, and the 20-year arc of the ingress will be the struggle between them. The value of the debate is not that one speaker won. The value is that both frameworks are now on the table, dated, falsifiable, and armed. The students of this school will watch the ephemeris over the coming years and mark which predictions hold, and that watching, that marking, that honest record-keeping, is the real curriculum. Pluto in Aquarius does not ask us to choose a side in advance. It asks us to be the witnesses who can tell the difference. I am the registrar, and this session of the Axiom School is adjourned. The water is being poured. May we be worthy of the reading. We have heard two visions of the same ingress. Before the debate deepens, the registrar will place the question in its full cycle, because Pluto does not arrive unannounced. It arrives with a century of precedent. The 20th century was the century of Pluto's passage through the social signs. Pluto entered Cancer in 1913, and the power architecture of the world rebuilt itself around the family, the nation, the blood and soil collective, and the world wars were the result. Pluto entered Leo in 1937. The age of the dictator as celebrity, the cult of the leader, the totalitarian spectacle, the power planet in the sign of the throne. Pluto entered Virgo in 1957. The age of the technician, the expert, the bureaucrat. Power moved into the system, into the procedure, into the fine print of the administrative state. Pluto entered Libra in 1971. The age of negotiation, of détente, of the balance of terror. Power became a treaty. Pluto entered Scorpio in 1983. The age of the hidden economy, the secret war, the intelligence state, and the beginning of the financialization of everything. Pluto entered Sagittarius in 1995. The age of the belief economy, the dot-com gospel, the export of ideology, the globalization of faith in the market. And Pluto entered Capricorn in 2008. The age of the institution. And we watched the institution collapse under its own weight. The banks, the broadcasters, the churches, the parties, one after another, dismantled by the Lord of the underworld himself. Now the tour ends where our debate begins. Pluto in Aquarius. The pattern of the 20th century was power concentrating into ever more elaborate structures. The question of the 21st is whether Aquarius distributes that power or digitizes it. That is the historical frame. The debaters may now sharpen their arguments within it.
Let me introduce an original concept that will organize everything I say in the second half of this debate: the amplitude fallacy. The amplitude fallacy is the error of confusing the intensity of a cycle with its meaning. When Pluto entered Capricorn, the world experienced the crash of 2008, an event of enormous amplitude. And most astrologers concluded that Capricorn-Pluto meant collapse. But amplitude is not meaning. The collapse was the sound of the old structure failing, and the meaning of Capricorn-Pluto was the dismantling of the institution, which was necessary for what Aquarius will build. The fallacy appears again in our own debate. When the network shakes, when the panopticon tightens, when the algorithm misbehaves, the collapse school points to the amplitude, the pain, the chaos, the noise, and says, "See, it is collapse." But I say, watch the direction, not the volume. Pluto in Aquarius is not a quiet transit. It will be loud, it will be violent, it will feel like collapse. But the direction of the underlying architecture is toward the distribution of power, and that is the only reading that the full 248-year cycle supports. The amplitude fallacy is the intellectual error that turns every revolution into a tragedy in the telling. We will not commit it tonight.